Tokyo, March 9, 1945. It is just past midnight. The sky above the Japanese capital is strangely quiet, a calm that feels unnatural. Down below, narrow wooden alleys breathe only darkness. Families sleep under tatami mats, trusting the cold spring air and the silence of the night. Then, faintly, a low hum begins. At first, no one notices. It's too deep, too steady, like a distant storm over the sea. But the hum grows, multiplying, vibrating through the earth itself. Windows tremble. Dogs howl. From a command post in Ichigaya, officers step onto the balcony. They squint upward. Nothing but blackness. Their radar has shown nothing. Their spotlights sweep the sky, empty. Then, suddenly, the wind shifts. Thousands of feet above, silver shadows glide through the night. B-29 Superfortresses. Their bomb bay doors open in unison. The first canisters tumble silently through the dark. For several seconds, there's only the whistle of falling metal. Then, Tokyo ignites. Within minutes, an ocean of fire consumes the city. Japanese commanders, staring in disbelief, realize the unimaginable. The Americans are bombing at midnight. And this was only the beginning. When the Pacific War erupted in 1941, Japan commanded the skies. Their pilots, trained in precision and sacrifice, flew Mitsubishi Zeros that outmatched anything the Allies could field. From the Philippines to Singapore, the Japanese advance seemed unstoppable. Yet even as Japan expanded its empire across Asia, a quiet realization took root within American strategy circles. Defeating Japan would require more than naval victories or island invasions. It would require breaking the empire's will from the air. But geography made that vision almost impossible. Japan lay thousands of miles from the nearest Allied bases. Early American bombers like the B-17 and B-24 lacked the range to reach the Japanese home islands. In 1942, the daring Doolittle raid proved symbolic. 16 small bombers took off from an aircraft carrier, struck Tokyo, and crash-landed in China. It terrified Japan's population, but did little physical damage. The lesson was clear. Without a long-range bomber, Japan was untouchable. Inside Boeing's Seattle plant, engineers had already begun designing a machine that could change that reality. The project was codenamed Model 345, later known as the B-29 Superfortress. It would become the most advanced bomber of the war, capable of flying above 30,000 feet at speeds exceeding 350 miles per hour, carrying up to 20,000 pounds of bombs, and traveling over 3,000 miles without refueling. The B-29's pressurized cabin allowed its crew to operate comfortably at high altitude, a luxury no previous bomber had offered. Its remote-controlled gun turrets were guided by analog computers, calculating lead angles in milliseconds. The Superfortress represented a leap not just in firepower, but in the technological imagination of war itself. Yet having the machine was one thing. Using it effectively against Japan was another. The American High Command established the XX Bomber Command in 1943 to oversee the new B-29 operations. Under General Hap Arnold, the U.S. Army Air Forces planned Operation Matterhorn, an ambitious idea to base B-29s in India, refuel them in western China, and strike industrial targets across Japan and Manchuria. Logistically, it was a nightmare. Everything, fuel, bombs, spare parts, had to be flown over the Himalayas, a route known as the Hump. Each supply mission risked violent weather, thin air, and Japanese fighters. For every gallon of fuel delivered to China, 5 were burned just getting there. The operation proved unsustainable. By mid-1944, B-29 raids were striking Yawata and Manchuria, but the results were disappointing. High-altitude precision bombing, copied from European strategies, failed over Japan's unpredictable jet streams. The winds at 30,000 feet scattered bombs across vast areas, reducing accuracy to chance. While crews struggled with technical malfunctions and navigation errors, Japanese cities continued to hum with wartime production. Japan's leaders, watching the American attempts from afar, began to believe that the threat of strategic bombing was exaggerated. "They cannot touch our homeland," one officer wrote in early 1944. It was a fatal assumption. Back in Washington, the pressure grew. President Roosevelt and General Arnold demanded results. They needed to prove the massive investment in the B-29 program had been worth it. The solution would come not from technology, but from geography. That summer, U.S. Marines captured Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, the Mariana Islands. These small, tropical outposts would change everything. From Tinian's runways, B-29s could reach Tokyo directly, carrying full bomb loads without the logistical nightmare of China. For the first time, the Japanese homeland lay within striking distance. The new bases were rapidly transformed into some of the largest airfields in the world. On Tinian alone, 4 parallel runways stretched across the coral surface, each built for the Superfortress. Hangars, fuel tanks, and ammunition dumps turned the island into a fortress of aviation. Crews began arriving in late 1944, young men who would soon carry out the most destructive air campaign in history. But even then, the Americans faced a crucial question: how to bomb Japan? High-altitude precision had failed. Japanese factories, scattered among wooden homes, defied simple targeting. Weather reports showed constant cloud cover and turbulence. Something had to change. That change would come with a man named Curtis LeMay, a strategist who believed that the key to victory lay not in daylight precision, but in total devastation. When Major General Curtis E. LeMay arrived in the Pacific in January 1945, he found the B-29 campaign in crisis. The aircraft were powerful, but their results were abysmal. Bombs routinely missed targets by miles. Weather, jet streams, and mechanical failures plagued every mission. American crews returned from raids exhausted and disillusioned, sometimes losing more aircraft to accidents than to enemy fire. LeMay, only 38 years old, was already infamous in the Air Force for his bluntness and ruthless efficiency. He had commanded bomber groups over Europe, pioneering the combat box formation that decimated German industry. Now, his task was to do the same to Japan, but under completely different skies. The problem was visibility. Japan's cities were almost always covered by clouds, and the high-altitude winds over the Pacific, sometimes exceeding 200 miles per hour, scattered bomb runs. Traditional bombing sites, calibrated for Europe, were useless here. After several failed raids, LeMay concluded that precision from altitude was an illusion. If the bombers could not hit their targets accurately, he reasoned, then they would have to burn everything around them. He shifted focus to area bombing, not destroying a single factory, but the entire industrial district surrounding it. Japan's war production was deeply intertwined with civilian neighborhoods, small workshops, family businesses, and cottage industries producing airplane parts, shells, and uniforms from wooden houses. The cities themselves had become vast, flammable machines of war. The shift was not merely tactical, it was psychological. For years, the U.S. had prided itself on precision bombing, striking military targets while avoiding civilians. LeMay's logic broke that taboo. "We're at war," he said later. "If we lose, we face a totalitarian future. If we win, we can discuss morality afterward." To execute this new vision, LeMay reorganized the 21 Bomber Command, based in the Mariana Islands. He studied weather patterns, analyzed bomb loads, and made radical adjustments to flight profiles. His most controversial decision came in early March 1945. Abandon high altitude altogether. Instead, B-29s would fly low, and at night, just 5,000 to 7,000 feet above the ground. Below radar detection, beneath the high-altitude winds, and inside the deadly zone of anti-aircraft guns. They would carry no defensive turrets, no heavy ammunition, every pound replaced with incendiary bombs. Each plane would drop M69 incendiaries, small canisters filled with jellied gasoline and magnesium, designed to ignite upon impact. At first, many commanders resisted. Flying unarmed bombers at low altitude over Japan sounded suicidal, but LeMay's calculations were precise. Japanese night fighters were rare, radar coverage was limited, and communication between defense units was chaotic. By the time Japan realized the new threat, it would already be too late. Meanwhile, in Tokyo, the illusion of security still lingered. Months of sporadic, ineffective daylight raids had convinced many that American bombers could not cause serious damage. Air defense units were under strength, anti-aircraft ammunition was scarce, and radar operators were poorly trained. Most cities practiced blackouts, but lacked coordinated response systems. The Japanese Home Ministry had repeatedly assured citizens that Tokyo's wooden architecture, the same that had survived centuries of earthquakes and fires, would not easily burn under aerial assault. The confidence bordered on arrogance. But in reality, Tokyo was a tinderbox. The city sprawled in narrow wooden lanes packed with paper walls, bamboo roofs, and kerosene lamps. The winter air was bone dry. The smallest spark could race across entire blocks. By February 1945, LeMay's first tests of incendiary tactics had begun. Raids over Kobe and Nagoya hinted at what was possible. Photographic reconnaissance revealed large swaths of industrial zones completely flattened, the fires burning long after the planes had gone. The data spoke for itself. Low-level night bombing worked. Still, LeMay knew he needed a demonstration, a single, overwhelming strike that would break Japan's will and prove his doctrine beyond question. He selected Tokyo. The capital was the beating heart of Japan's war machine, housing munitions factories, arsenals, and government offices, all surrounded by millions of civilians. If Tokyo could be crippled, the psychological effect would reverberate across the empire. Preparations began in early March. Ground crews on Tinian loaded B-29s with more than 1,600 tons of incendiaries. Maintenance teams stripped turrets and ammunition. Crews were briefed to fly in darkness at low altitude and to expect chaos below. LeMay's words were simple. You will fly tonight. You will set Tokyo afire. On the Japanese side, no one knew what was coming. Intelligence had reported increased American activity in the Marianas, but, with no major raids for weeks, commanders assumed another high-altitude daylight attack, something their defenses had learned to endure. As twilight fell on March 9th, Tokyo prepared for another ordinary night. Lights dimmed. Air defense units stood by, calm and weary. The city exhaled under the cool wind of early spring. Far out over the Pacific, 334 bombers were already climbing into the sky. The Boeing B-29 Superfortress was more than an aircraft. It was the most advanced flying system of its time, a machine so complex that engineers joked it had been built a decade too soon. Over 100,000 individual parts, 4 Wright R-3350 duplex Cyclone engines, and an onboard analog computing system that adjusted fire control automatically. The Superfortress was a technological gamble born from desperation. Its design allowed something never before possible: intercontinental reach. With pressurized cabins and remote-operated gun turrets, The B-29 could fly higher, faster, and farther than any bomber before it. In theory, it could deliver destruction to any point on Earth, but that sophistication came at a price. Engines overheated and caught fire mid-air. Fuel leaks were common. Each flight risked catastrophic failure. Inside the aircraft, 10 men lived in 2 pressurized compartments connected by a narrow tunnel running above the bomb bays. The air was cold, the noise constant, and every vibration reminded them of how much depended on the machine holding together. Many pilots compared flying the B-29 to sitting atop a volcano with wings. Yet for all its flaws, the Superfortress embodied America's industrial might. Each aircraft cost more than $600,000, nearly the price of a small naval destroyer. Factories in Kansas and Washington worked around the clock to produce them, while 20,000 technicians and engineers supported the program across 19 assembly plants. It was an industrial war effort built to achieve one objective: bring Japan to its knees from the sky. By early 1945, the B-29 fleet represented not only American technology, but also a new form of warfare, one where distance, altitude, and human risk were balanced by machines that turned the act of bombing into near-mechanical precision. It was the perfect weapon for a strategist like Curtis LeMay. 2. The tactical angle, LeMay's doctrine of fire. LeMay's rethinking of air warfare defied everything the U.S. Air Force had believed about honorable bombing. His logic was cold but effective. If precision failed, destruction itself must become the strategy. The new doctrine was built on 4 pillars. First, altitude. By dropping from 30,000 to 7,000 feet, the bombers escaped the jet stream, allowing tighter formation and greater accuracy. Second, timing. The raids would strike deep in the night, when Japanese fighters were grounded and visibility was near zero. Third, payload. Every defensive gun, every ounce of armor, was removed to make room for incendiaries. Napalm-filled M69 bombs, small but devastating, designed to scatter burning gel into wooden structures. And fourth, saturation. Instead of single targets, entire urban grids were mapped into bombing zones, each plane assigned to a specific sector. The goal was to overlap fires until they merged into an uncontrollable inferno, a firestorm capable of consuming an entire city. LeMay's staff called it urban combustion science. For Tokyo, the plan was brutally efficient. The first B-29s would drop incendiaries on the city's perimeter, blocking escape routes. The next waves would target the core, the Shitamachi district, packed with homes and small workshops. Wind forecasts predicted strong gusts from the southwest. LeMay used that to his advantage, plotting bomb runs to ride the wind directly into Tokyo's heart. The simplicity of the plan masked its horror. The objective was no longer to destroy a target. It was to ignite the city itself. The tactic combined meteorology, engineering, and psychology into one act of devastation. LeMay was not ignorant of what this meant. He knew the fires would kill tens of thousands of civilians, but his belief, unshaken, was that ending the war quickly would ultimately save more lives than it cost. "If you kill enough of them," he told his staff, "they stop fighting." That line, grim, logical, merciless, became the unspoken doctrine of the Pacific skies. 3. The human angle, the men inside the superfortresses. For the crews of the 73rd and 313th Bomb Wings, the orders came like a shock. Many had trained for daylight precision, using bomb sights, altitude, and formation discipline. Now, they were being told to fly into enemy skies at night, stripped of defensive guns, and to drop incendiaries instead of explosives. It felt less like bombing and more like execution. Each B-29 carried a crew of 10: pilot, co-pilot, bombardier, navigator, flight engineer, radio operator, radar operator, and gunners. They were young, most in their early 20s, trained for duty, not the moral weight of what was coming. On the evening of March 9, 1945, they gathered on the runways of Tinian Island, the sea air thick with humidity and fuel vapors. The sunset cast a red glow over the coral airfield. The mission briefing was short. LeMay's instructions were final. Low altitude, full incendiary load, no defensive fire. You'll be over target by midnight, the crews were told. Expect turbulence, expect flak, expect chaos. As engines roared to life, each bomber trembled under the weight of 7 tons of incendiaries. The sound of 2,300 engines filled the island. One by one, they rose into the darkness, long chains of silver silhouettes fading into the Pacific night. For many airmen, this was the moment the war became something else. They were no longer hunting ships or striking factories. They were about to set a city ablaze from one horizon to the other. At 5,000 feet, they could see the faint curve of the earth and the black void of the ocean below. Ahead, only darkness. Behind, the soft glow of Tinian shrinking into nothing. Each man sat in silence, thinking of what lay beyond that horizon. A city asleep, unaware that history's most destructive air raid was already on its way. 4. The Japanese leadership angle. Disbelief in the skies. When the first radar blips appeared on Japanese scopes shortly before midnight on March 9, 1945, few officers believed they were genuine. The readings showed hundreds of aircraft, but at an altitude too low for conventional bombers. The operators assumed it was interference, perhaps ground echoes from the bay. At the Imperial General Headquarters in Tokyo, senior officers were equally dismissive. For years, they had studied American raids and concluded that the B-29's greatest limitation was range. They came high, slow, and predictable. Night bombing on such a scale was unthinkable. Then came the first reports, fragments of radio messages from southern observation posts. Enemy aircraft sighted, low altitude, many, heading north. Within minutes, confusion spread through command lines. Air defense units scrambled fighters, but Japan's night interception capabilities were primitive. The Nakajima J-1N Gecko and Kawasaki Ki-45 Toryu night fighters were few and ill-equipped. Searchlights swept blindly across the city. Radar operators struggled to coordinate. Anti-aircraft batteries, manned by exhausted crews and teenage trainees, opened fire without clear targets. From the command balcony in Ichigaya, officers watched the horizon flicker, first red, then orange. At Urzuro 15, firestorms began to bloom across the city's eastern wards. Telephone lines collapsed almost immediately. Commanders could no longer reach police, fire brigades, or civil defense units. By 01 the situation was beyond comprehension. Reports came in from the Koto and Shitamachi districts, entire blocks vanishing in minutes. One staff officer later recalled, "It was as if the night had become a sea of fire, and the city was sinking into it." Even then, the high command refused to believe what was happening. Some assumed that fuel depots had been struck accidentally. Others believed the Americans had used chemical agents. It would take until dawn for them to understand. This was a new kind of bombing, one that rendered defense meaningless. 5. The civilian angle. Tokyo in flames. In the narrow back streets of Tokyo's Shitamachi, people were already running. Incendiary bombs fell like rain, small, clattering cylinders that bounced once before bursting into flame. Each one spread burning gel that clung to everything it touched. Wood, fabric, skin. The fires multiplied faster than anyone could react. Within 30 minutes, the flames joined together, creating what physicists would later describe as a firestorm effect. Superheated air rose at hundreds of miles per hour, pulling in oxygen from all directions. The wind grew so violent that people were lifted from the ground. Whole houses ignited simultaneously. Streets turned into tunnels of fire. Civil defense units tried to form bucket brigades, but the heat melted their hoses. Firefighters collapsed in their suits, suffocated by lack of air. Civilians fled toward the rivers, the Sumida and Arakawa, believing water would save them. But the rivers were soon filled with people, bridges burning above them. Eyewitnesses recalled how the air itself was on fire. From above, B-29 crews saw nothing of this horror, only glowing clouds, shimmering in the darkness, and the reflection of flames stretching 100 miles across the sea. One gunner later said it was like flying over the mouth of a volcano. By 2 a.m., Tokyo was no longer a city. It was a single continuous blaze, visible from 150 miles away. Entire neighborhoods, Asakusa, Kamedo, Honjo, were erased in hours. Survivor Hasegawa Yoshiko, then 14, described it decades later. The sound was not of bombs, but of air itself screaming. I saw people running with their clothes on fire, carrying their children, and the wind tore them apart. The raid lasted barely 3 hours. When it ended, over 100,000 people were dead. More than Hiroshima, more than Nagasaki. 1 million were left homeless. But in those first hours, neither side fully understood the scale of what had occurred. The Japanese command thought it was a temporary disaster. The Americans believed it was only the beginning. 6. The moral angle, the fire, and the conscience. Even among American commanders, the firebombing of Tokyo raised questions that no one could easily answer. The mission had achieved its tactical goals: the destruction of Tokyo ES industrial base and transport network, but it had also annihilated a civilian population. At dawn on March 10th, when reconnaissance photographs returned, they showed a city that had vanished. Entire districts appeared as black voids on the map. LeMay studied the photos in silence. "We knew we had done something terrible," one intelligence officer later recalled. The official report was clinical. 16 square miles of Tokyo destroyed, 90,000 casualties estimated. But internally, debate grew. Was this war or something else entirely? In Washington, President Roosevelt received the figures with mixed feelings. The operation was militarily successful, yet morally uncharted. Later, General Henry Hap Arnold would admit that even the U.S. command had not expected such devastation. For LeMay, there was no hesitation. He maintained that the firebombing had saved lives by hastening Japan's surrender. In his memoirs, he would write simply, "There are no innocent factories. There are no clean wars." Yet, for the men who dropped the bombs, and for those who lived through the inferno below, the moral boundaries of warfare had been forever altered. The B-29 crews returned to Tinian to find silence in the debriefing rooms. No cheering, no celebration, just exhaustion. And the image of that glowing horizon burned into their memory. On the other side of the Pacific, Tokyo's survivors crawled through ashes, searching for family members who would never be found. Among the ruins, Japanese commanders realized that the war had entered a new dimension, one where even the night itself could no longer protect them. And as dawn rose over a city of smoke, Curtis LeMay was already preparing his next orders. March 9, 1945, 11:58 p.m. The first wave of B-29s crossed the coast of Honshu. Below them, Tokyo was a black ocean of rooftops. There were no searchlights, no visible defenses, only the faint gleam of moonlight off the Sumida River. The Americans had caught Japan completely off guard. The lead aircraft, flown by Brigadier General Thomas Power, released a trail of incendiaries over the southeastern district of Koto. These were not explosives, but markers, streams of magnesium fire that drew a line for the following bombers. Within seconds, the city's grid began to glow. The next wave dropped clusters of M69 incendiaries, each bursting into dozens of flaming cylinders that scattered across wooden homes and workshops. At first, there was confusion. In some neighborhoods, residents mistook the initial explosions for lightning. But within minutes, hundreds of fires broke out simultaneously. The flames raced through the narrow alleys, feeding on tatami mats, paper walls, and oil lamps. The dry winter air turned every spark into an inferno. Inside command bunkers, Japanese officers tried to issue countermeasures, but communication was collapsing. Power lines melted. Telephone operators abandoned their posts. The city's firefighting network, one of the largest in Asia, was overwhelmed almost instantly. By 12:30 a.m., the flames merged into a single firestorm. The air temperature rose above 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit. The heat generated its own wind, pulling oxygen into the core of the fire at hurricane speeds. People caught in the open were blown off their feet, their clothes igniting before they hit the ground. Wooden homes exploded as air inside them combusted. Asphalt bubbled. Metal twisted. For the crews above, the scene was almost surreal. At 5,000 feet, turbulence tossed the bombers like ships in a storm. The glow of Tokyo's fires illuminated the undersides of their wings. Some crewmen could read their instruments without cockpit lights. Smoke climbed so high it entered their oxygen systems. One pilot wrote later, "It was like looking into a furnace the size of a city. I could feel the heat through the glass." In the Shitamachi district, where the fire first concentrated, entire families fled toward the Sumida River, believing the water would save them. Thousands crowded the banks, but the wind-driven flames followed, crossing the bridges and consuming everything in their path. Many leapt into the river, only to find the surface covered in burning debris. By 1:30 a.m., Tokyo was unrecognizable. From the imperial palace, Emperor Hirohito could see the red glow to the east. He was told that large portions of the capital were under attack, but the scale was beyond any military report. Eyewitnesses recalled that the palace windows shook from the shockwaves. In Ichigaya, staff officers tried to coordinate anti-aircraft batteries, but the B-29s flew too low, too fast, and too many. Some gunners fired blindly into the smoke. Others simply stopped, realizing the futility. "We could not even see the enemy," one soldier said later. "Only the fire." Back on Tinian, LeMay's operations center tracked the mission by radio. Sporadic messages came through the static. Reports of turbulence, of smoke, of navigation errors. Then, as the hours passed, silence. Only after 3 a.m. did the first bombers begin to return. Their crews were exhausted, dehydrated, covered in sweat and soot. One aircraft had its paint blistered from the heat of the fire below. At 4:30 a.m., the last wave of B-29s cleared the target area. Behind them, Tokyo burned uncontrolled. The city's heart, from the Sumida to Ueno, was a single sheet of flame. At dawn, reconnaissance aircraft flew over the ruins. What they photographed defied comprehension. Smoke rose in columns 10 miles high. Entire districts, Asakusa, Honjo, Fukagawa, were gone, reduced to ash. Survivors wandered the streets barefoot, dazed, carrying the remains of loved ones wrapped in blankets. The rivers were filled with bodies. That morning, LeMay received the first radio report from a returning pilot. Mission complete. Target area obliterated. He didn't celebrate. He only ordered, "Prepare the next one." The destruction of Tokyo was not the end. It was proof. Proof that Japan could be burned into submission. But even as LeMay prepared for new raids, Japan's commanders, staring into the ashes of their capital, began to realize that the empire they had built could not withstand the fire from above. When the sun rose over Tokyo on March 10, 1945, the city no longer existed in any recognizable form. The morning wind carried ash across the bay, drifting toward Chiba and Yokohama. Entire neighborhoods had vanished into gray nothingness. Only foundations, iron stoves, and fragments of roof tiles remained. For 30 miles, the air smelled of burnt cedar and flesh. Japanese rescue units entered the ruins at dawn. What they found silenced even the most hardened soldiers. The fires still smoldered, forming walls of heat that made movement nearly impossible. Streets had melted together, unrecognizable beneath the soot. The only landmarks were the rivers, now clogged with the bodies of those who had tried to escape. In the ruins of Honjo, the police found entire families huddled in cellars, suffocated by lack of oxygen. In Asakusa, monks from Sensoji Temple prayed over the dead, their chants echoing through a landscape that resembled the aftermath of an earthquake. For the Imperial Japanese Army, the devastation was incomprehensible. Reports began arriving at headquarters throughout the morning, each one more grim than the last. By noon, the Home Ministry estimated that 16 square miles of the capital had been completely destroyed. Fire brigades across the country sent messages of condolence and fear. Tokyo, the heart of the empire, had been erased in a single night. General Kawabe Masakazu, Deputy Chief of Staff, wrote in his diary that day, "The enemy has found a new way to fight. We have no answer to this." The realization cut deep. Japan's air defenses had failed. Its radar systems, already limited, had proven useless against low-flying night bombers. Its anti-aircraft artillery was nearly spent, and its fighter units were grounded by lack of fuel. The illusion of homeland security, the belief that Japan's sacred islands were untouchable, evaporated overnight. The military attempted to maintain order. Propaganda newspapers framed the attack as a brutal but temporary act of desperation. But inside government offices, panic spread. The Ministry of War requested immediate reinforcements for air defense, but none existed. Industry leaders begged for relocation of factories to rural areas. Even Emperor Hirohito, upon receiving the first detailed damage map, reportedly stood in silence for several minutes before whispering, "Is this the fate of the nation?" The shock was not only physical, but psychological. Across Japan, people who had once believed in divine protection now whispered of inevitable defeat. For the first time, the empire's citizens saw that the war could reach every home, every street, every child. Meanwhile, in the Marianas, the returning crews of the B-29s faced their own reckoning. At dawn, as the bombers landed one by one on Tinian, ground crews counted only a handful missing, a remarkably low loss rate given the scale of destruction inflicted. When the airmen gathered for debriefing, there was no applause. The mission had succeeded beyond expectation, but no one felt triumph. A few spoke quietly about what they had seen. Flames rising higher than clouds, turbulence so fierce it shook the plane like paper, the light so bright it blinded them through the windows. Others refused to talk at all. One gunner wrote later in his journal, "I think we burned women and children alive tonight, but the officers said it would end the war sooner. I hope they're right." General Curtis LeMay read the after-action reports that afternoon. He did not flinch. He had expected 100 aircraft losses. Fewer than 10 had been destroyed. The results were conclusive. Low-altitude incendiary raids worked. That night, he authorized the next wave. Nagoya, Osaka, Kobe. Each would follow the same pattern. Night approach, low altitude, incendiary saturation. Between March and June 1945, 67 Japanese cities were firebombed. More than 500,000 civilians were killed, and millions left homeless. Japan's urban network collapsed. Factories ceased production, railways melted, and communications fell apart. In Washington, the War Department analyzed the Tokyo raid with clinical detachment. The results confirmed what LeMay already knew. Japan could be destroyed without invasion. But for some, the success was unsettling. Henry Stimson, the U.S. Secretary of War, warned privately that the line between victory and savagery grows thinner each night. Yet, in the logic of total war, LeMay's campaign had achieved its purpose. Japan was burning faster than it could rebuild. Each midnight raid shattered another fragment of the empire's will to fight. Even before Hiroshima, many within Japan's leadership had begun to concede that surrender was inevitable. They just didn't know when or how it would come. And as Tokyo smoldered in the days that followed, a new kind of warfare was being born. One that replaced the precision of bombs with the certainty of annihilation. From the ashes of Tokyo, the age of strategic firepower had begun. The morning after the raid, March 10, 1945, Tokyo resembled a vision from another world. From the air, reconnaissance photos showed a pale scar cutting through the capital. 16 square miles of flattened ruin. The pattern of destruction was so complete that U.S. analysts struggled to identify once familiar landmarks. Only the Sumida River glistened through the haze, a silver thread winding through fields of ash. On the ground, the silence was unbearable. The survivors emerged slowly, their faces gray with soot, their eyes empty. Some wandered barefoot, clutching pieces of burned wood or fragments of their homes. Others searched for family members among the bodies that filled the parks, the riverbanks, and the open squares. Official Japanese reports would later estimate nearly 100,000 dead, though independent studies suggest the true number was higher, perhaps 130,000, making it the single deadliest air raid in human history, surpassing even Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Over 1 million civilians were left homeless in a single night. In the Shitamachi district, where the fires burned hottest, an entire culture was erased. The artisans, carpenters, and craftsmen who had sustained Tokyo's pre-war soul were gone. Temples that had stood for centuries were reduced to blackened outlines. Children's metal lunchboxes were found fused together by the heat. The smell of burning lingered for weeks. Japanese civil defense forces tried to bring order, but chaos reigned. Water systems were destroyed. Food deliveries stopped. Hospitals overflowed with the burned and the blind. Many victims died days later, not from flames, but from infection and shock. The emperor ordered mass cremations to prevent disease. Smoke rose again from the ruins, this time from funeral pyres. In the imperial palace, Emperor Hirohito received daily briefings. His staff described the destruction in cautious language, calling it extensive damage. But when aerial photographs reached the palace, there was no more room for illusion. The heart of his empire, the capital itself, was gone. From that day onward, Hirohito began to ask his advisors not how to win the war, but how to end it. Across the Pacific, the reaction was complex. American newspapers hailed the raid as a breakthrough. Headlines read, "Tokyo burns, victory from the air." To the public, It seemed the long, grinding war in the Pacific was finally turning decisively in America's favor. Factories cheered, politicians praised LeMay's tactics, and few questioned the moral cost. But among some commanders and diplomats, unease grew. Admiral William Leahy, President Truman's chief of staff, later wrote in his diary, "Killing Japanese civilians by wholesale will not shorten the war by one day. It is barbaric." LeMay, however, remained unmoved. He believed Japan's refusal to surrender justified any measure that could bring the war to an end sooner, sparing, in his logic, even greater casualties from an invasion. His bombers continued their midnight missions, flattening Nagoya, Osaka, and Kobe within weeks. Each city burned as Tokyo had burned, and each time the losses mounted. Yet within Japan, the bombings began to achieve their intended effect. Not through terror, but through exhaustion. Morale crumbled. Civilians no longer fled to shelters. They accepted death as part of life. Workers stopped showing up for factories that no longer existed. The military's propaganda machine could no longer hide the truth. Even school children wrote in diaries that the sky brings death every night. For many Japanese commanders, the Tokyo raid was a revelation. That the war was no longer about territory or honor, but survival itself. It marked the point where Japan's defeat became not just probable, but inevitable. And yet, as Tokyo's ashes cooled, a darker weapon was already being prepared, one that would make the fires of March seem almost primitive. In the weeks following the Tokyo firebombing, Japan was a country in slow collapse. Every night, the sound of distant engines returned, the heavy, rhythmic drone of B-29s. Each time, another city vanished beneath the flames. Nagoya, Osaka, Kobe, one by one, they were reduced to rubble. Between March and August 1945, 67 cities were firebombed. Nearly 500,000 civilians died. 10 million were left without homes. The air raids dismantled Japan's ability to fight. Rail lines melted, power grids failed, and communication between military commands broke down. Factories relocated into caves or countryside barns, but production plummeted. Japan's once proud industrial heart was now an archipelago of ashes. For the government, the collapse brought a deeper crisis, one of spirit. The emperor's ministers argued over surrender, but fear of internal revolt and shame before history paralyzed them. To the military elite, surrender still meant dishonor worse than death. And so, even as the capital lay in ruins, the war dragged on. The American High Command watched from afar. From his office on Tinian, General Curtis LeMay studied reconnaissance photos with cold precision. He measured success in square miles destroyed, not in human terms. His conclusion was blunt. Japan could be defeated entirely through fire. "If we lose the war," he told his staff, "we'll be tried as war criminals. But if we win, history will say we were right." LeMay's incendiary raids had done what years of naval blockades could not. They had brought Japan to its knees. Yet even as cities burned, Tokyo refused to surrender. That reality frustrated Washington. American planners, fearing a drawn-out siege of the Japanese home islands, began to look toward another weapon, one that promised instant, absolute destruction. In July 1945, as the ruins of Tokyo still smoldered, a new flash illuminated the desert sky of New Mexico. The Trinity test, the first detonation of an atomic bomb, confirmed that a single bomb could do what 1,000 B-29s could not. Within weeks, the weapon's use was authorized. When Hiroshima was destroyed on August 6, 1945, the shock was total. But for many Japanese survivors of Tokyo, the horror was hauntingly familiar. The blinding light, the heat, the firestorms, They had seen it all before, only now condensed into one instant. In a grim sense, Tokyo had been a rehearsal for Hiroshima. 3 days later, Nagasaki followed. By August 15th, Emperor Hirohito broke a tradition older than the empire itself. He spoke directly to his people. His voice, broadcast across the shattered nation, trembled as he announced surrender. "The war situation has developed not necessarily to Japan's advantage," he said. Few understood the words clearly, but the tone was unmistakable. The war was over. For Japan, the cost was beyond comprehension. More than 3 million dead, entire cities erased, and a generation left scarred. For the United States, the campaign had proven the power of total air warfare. Yet, even among the victors, doubts lingered. In the years that followed, historians and soldiers alike would argue over the morality of the firebombings. Some saw them as necessary, a brutal but decisive step toward ending a war that had already consumed millions. Others saw them as a crime, the moment when war crossed a line and never looked back. LeMay himself never apologized. When asked years later if he regretted the fire raids, he answered simply, "No, it shortened the war. That's what counts." But for the survivors who rebuilt Tokyo from the ashes, every gust of wind that stirred the dust carried memories of that midnight inferno, of the sky that turned white, and the world that burned beneath it. The Tokyo firebombing was not only an attack on a city, it was a message to the world that in modern war, there are no longer battlefields, only targets. In the silence that followed 1945, Tokyo began to breathe again. From the ashes of 16 square miles of ruin, a new city would one day rise, one of glass, steel, and light. But beneath its foundations lay a memory the world still struggles to face. The firebombing of Tokyo was more than a military operation. It was the moment humanity realized that technology had outgrown morality. For centuries, war had been fought on battlefields, soldier against soldier, weapon against weapon. But that night, war became something else. A storm unleashed upon the innocent. The B-29s that roared above Tokyo were marvels of engineering, machines of precision and power. Yet in their bomb bays hung thousands of canisters designed not to destroy armies, but to ignite lives. Each fell with the weight of a philosophy, that total war justified total destruction. For the men who carried out the mission, there was no hatred in their hearts, only duty and exhaustion. For those below, there was no anger left, only silence and smoke. Between them stretched a void that no victory could fill. The ashes of Tokyo became the blueprint for a new kind of warfare. In the decades that followed, from Korea to Vietnam to the Middle East, the lessons of March 1945 echoed again. The belief that terror could bring peace, that destruction could force surrender. But history would show that fire never ends wars. It only changes their shape. Today, few who walk the streets of modern Tokyo can imagine what once happened there. Neon towers stand where wooden homes once burned. The rivers that once carried the dead now reflect the city's electric glow. Yet beneath that light lies a quiet truth, that progress and tragedy are often born from the same spark. The night the B-29s came to Tokyo, the world crossed an invisible line, from the age of battles to the age of annihilation. And though the war ended months later, the questions it raised about power, humanity, and mercy remain unanswered still.